Hello and welcome to our fourth episode of our YouTube series. We are joined today by Dr. David Landy, who lectures in sociology in Trinity College Dublin. He is also the author of Jewish Identity and Palestinian Rights. He is talking with us today about the Jewish diaspora and its changing relationship with Israel. It's a really good talk. I really hope you enjoy it. And if you'd like to see some more, please like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please follow us on Instagram at Teachers for Palestine or on Twitter at Teachers4Pal. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Over to you, David.
And thanks for inviting me here. So I'll be talking about the diaspora Jewish relationship to Israel and how it's changed over the years. But I'm aware I'm talking at a certain time. There's a possible ceasefire happening about 4 months into Israel's attack on Gaza. Now, last weekend, the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel was plausibly committing genocide, and it ordered it to stop. In response, Israel ramped up the killings, and in support of this attack, which must be termed genocidal at this stage, Western governments have cut off funding to UNRWA, which was providing humanitarian aid to Gazans. So these are despairing times. And last week was also Holocaust Memorial Day, where events took place that bluntly were used to whitewash this genocide. These events, organized by Holocaust education groups, platformed Israeli representatives. In Ireland, the Israeli ambassador spoke at it, and people who supported Israel. And they allowed them to attack supporters of Palestine as being anti-Semitic, but otherwise to ignore Gaza, pretending this genocide hasn't happened. And this all has led people to ask, like, why do diaspora Jews support Israel? It's complicated. You know, some do, some don't. But also, it's changed over the years. Support and opposition has become more intense as Jews have become more polarized. And I'll be looking at this in this talk. I'll start by explaining some odd features of early Zionism, and then I'll discuss why Jews used to support Israel, identity rather than ideology. And then I'll be looking at the contemporary situation, because on one hand, you have Zionism that's been pushing some Jews further rightwards. And on the other hand, you're having a growing movement expressing Jewish disenchantment with Israel. So let's start from the start, from Zionism. So, you know, Zionism, one way of viewing it, this support for a Jewish state, is as a form of, I suppose, long-distance nationalism for Jews. I'll just get up the slideshow now. Long-distance nationalism for Jewish people. And, you know, like Irish American nationalism or whatever. And customarily, this nationalism is a way of keeping a diaspora community together. A nation enables a diaspora to imagine itself as a collective thing. And because of this, diasporas are far more likely to support and to stress kind of primordial racial togetherness. In many ways, this is all they have to bind themselves together, unlike people at home. And this means that diasporas usually express the more xenophobic elements of the nation. They're keener to support armed expressions of nationalism than those at home. And we've seen it in the past with Irish Americans and their support of NORAID and what's called irresponsible nationalism. But you see, there's something specific about the Jewish diaspora. And the specific thing is it's not from Israel. And Jews have managed to keep themselves together in the diaspora for centuries, not needing a nation to ground itself. So we need to start here with the origins of Zionism. Now, Zionism arose about 100 years ago. Most Jews lived in Russia and Eastern Europe, and their existence was threatened by the growth of nationalism at the time, which meant that Jews were seen as this matter out of place. They needed to be removed from this newly discovered national space. And so you can see Zionism as being inspired by, as well as a defensive reaction to this blood and soil nationalism that drove them out of their homes. Now, on reaching Palestine, it was also inspired by existing colonialism, which saw it as like pretty normal to take somebody else's territory if you were racially superior. Indeed, taking a kind of proved your racial superiority. But fundamentally, Zionism arose as a movement to correct this Jewish out-of-placeness. And one of the promises of Zionism was to normalize the Jews and enable them to become a normal nation like other normal nations. Now, implicit in this normalization is the demand that the unique characteristics of diaspora Jews and Jewish life would have to be extirpated. In other words, Zionism was founded on the negation of the diaspora. So when Zeev Jabotinsky, one of the early Zionists, said, eliminate the diaspora will surely eliminate you, he wasn't talking about physical elimination, but forming a new cultural template, fashioning a new identity. And proponents of Zionist identity sought to fashion new Jews. And this has been seen by Daniel Boyarin and others as a crude effort to emulate, to imitate conventional European Christian codes of maleness. So this new figure, this rugged, violent, muscle Jew that was being promoted by early Zionists like Max Nordau, was being promoted in direct opposition to the previous ideal of masculinity Jews previously had, of like a pale-skinned, studious, and physically fragile ideal of masculinity, which yes, much more appeals to me somehow. Beyond this, there was bizarrely a repetition of anti-Semitic attacks on the diaspora. Like in contrast to the real, authentic Jews who tilled the land and shed their blood for Eretz Yisrael, diaspora Jews were seen as living sick, spiritually unfulfilling lives. I'll give you some quotes here about this. From Jacob Klatskin at the time. Now, this language has abated somewhat about exile dragging out the disgrace of our people. But this depiction of authentic, strong Israelis and weak, pathetic diaspora subjects was satirized more recently by the cartoonist Eli Valley, who in this particular cartoon here, Israel Man and Diaspora Boy, where he's kind of envisaging the relationship between diaspora and Israel, as Israel Man as being the muscle Jew on steroids, this unreal fantasy figure of Zionism. And Diaspora Boy is the epitome of a self-hating diaspora Zionist. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the tensions here. It's understandable that the negation of the diaspora was quite strong among early Zionists in order to, encourage people to move away from the diaspora. And so it might be still around, but in very attenuated form. Because we need to move on. We need to actually say, well, what happened after the establishment of the State of Israel? And we need to ask ourselves, why would most diaspora Jews, with no intention of moving to Israel, why would they support the nationalism of another country? And the reason why is because the Jewish community, so-called, was changing. Once, the question of who was a Jew used to be fairly easy to answer. A Jew was someone who behaved like a Jew, lived among Jews, followed Jewish religious laws. Judaism is a communal religion, and the practices of the religion are the things that are stressed. So there were clear boundary markers of being Jewish: religious practices, separate foodways, even a separate language, Yiddish, and so on. And Jews, especially in the US, where most diaspora Jews now were, they lived in large urban Jewish communities. But after World War II, there was a change. There was a drift to the suburbs, and there was a de-religification of Jewish life in the diaspora. And then there was this sense of community bounded by religion and place. It began to attenuate, and something needed to replace it. And what replaced it was Zionism. And this Zionism was promoted in response to the need for diaspora Jews to develop a focus for unity and to develop a content to their Jewishness beyond religion. The narrative of Holocaust in Europe and redemption, rebirth in Israel became, in a commonly used phrase of the time, the civil religion of Jews in the 1970s, and it replaced previous notions of a collectivity based in religious practices. Now, honestly, I find it ironic that Jews in the diaspora focused around long distance nationalism and victim narratives precisely when they became fully integrated into society. But it was because Zionism had become this boundary marker for Jewish identity. Now, there were communal, internal needs for Zionism as well. You know, Jews are, like other people, a very diverse group of people. And the practices of Zionism were a way of bringing this diverse group of people together. I'm not denying self-evident political nature of Zionism, but I am saying that from within the community, the social aspect, the bringing people together predominated, and it provided a structure for Jewish activities outside the synagogue. And this is important for, let's say, the Irish Jewish community, which was traditionally has been riven by religious quarrels. Israel was an opportunity to express a sense of togetherness, to be with other Jews, and also a sense of belonging to the international Jewish community as well. And the planting of trees in Israel, which was an activity organized by the Jewish National Fund, which I'll talk about later, encapsulates a lot of the aspects of diaspora Zionism. You know, what happened was diaspora Jews donate money to the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, towards planting trees in Israel. And it allows them to display their link with Israel in Ireland. But it also performs a social aspect of Zionism because people give trees to each other as presents. The yearly magazine of the JNF publishes lists of tree givers. And so it exhibits, it fosters social relations. And the other reason for trees was, as one person said to me, no, you can't argue with trees. So we have a situation where defending Israel was important for diaspora Jews, but it was because it was seen very much as standing up for themselves. And so, you know, this is a Zionism which is in some ways a contentless marker, whose main demand is its need to be defended, since by doing so, you defend yourself. You defend, if somebody attacks Israel, you assume they're attacking you. Because Israel was seen as still a semi-mystical idea, a religious symbol, and an element of people's identity impervious to rational criticism. But the thing is, moving on to modern times, Zionism isn't just a contentless marker. It's one that increasingly has, as we know ourselves, physical meaning as Israel seeks people to defend it. And Israel is increasingly, in the new millennium, promoting stage encounters between itself and diaspora Jews, as these diaspora Jews are increasingly being enlisted in this fight to defend Israel. Now, I'm going to talk about the most famous of these efforts, which is Birthright Israel. Because it's an emblematic effort. It's a means that was used to counter growing Jewish assimilation, as well as counter growing Jewish distance from Israel. So what these Birthright Israel is these free 10 days tours of Israel funded by Israeli and diaspora Jewish organizations and given to 18 to 30-year-old diaspora Jews in an effort to connect them to Israel, in an effort to connect them to their Jewishness, and in an effort to connect this Jewishness to Israel. And hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested in ensuring younger Jews see the connection with Israel as an essential part of their identity. The tours typically include visit to these main sites of Zionist and Jewish collective memory, like Masada, the Western Wall, the Holocaust Museum. And there are also trips to see the Israeli army in a positive way. And these exist alongside fun excursions to seaside resorts like Eilat. Now, these excursions are designed to reinforce this feeling of gratitude that participants feel towards Birthright Israel, and are also designed to sugar the didactic purposes of the tour. Because there's loads of lectures, there's loads of group discussions about, well, how wonderful Israel is in this thing. And I'm going to show you a very brief clip from a film, Israel Limited, by the Israeli filmmaker Mor Lushi. taken in 2009, so it's a bit old, but it's still relevant. A more modern film to watch is Israelism, which is showing how a cult like Zionism is foisted, especially on younger Jews. So I'll just stop sharing here and share the other screen now.
I'm sure that now on, when you will open TV and hear news about Israel, you won't believe anything that they say in the TV. And I think that the next time you see some Israeli soldier in a checkpoint in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, just think that this guy that looking in TV very, very scary and very, very bad and mean and everything, he has a full personality. He has a family, he has a girlfriend, he has someone at home waiting for him. This is our life as Israelis. It's all the things together.
That's how the war started.
I was like, I want to go over there and I want to kick some butt right now because, I mean, I felt like I was standing in a war zone.
We're gonna see the beds that the soldiers are sleeping at, and maybe we're gonna see a small kitchen where they made their food. Okay, just look around and think what it's like to live there, like 1 week, 1 month, maybe 1 year. Okay, it's difficult, and you're gonna get inside. You can take your pictures.
We'll start the share now. You can see, and they take part in mock army exercises. So you can see what's being promoted is a particular type of right-wing nationalism. And the problem is, like, a necessary element in believing Israel to be the real home of the Jewish people is facing the existence of indigenous Palestinians that happens on these tours. In some of these Potemkin tours, participants manage to meet carefully selected Arab Israelis who will tell them how good Israel is, but usually they're kept away from them, told they're dangerous, referred to in derogatory ways. Now, I've talked about birthright Israel, but in my research on tourism in Jerusalem, that all tourism is structured in this way, with similar right-wing tropes on the encounters with Israel. So the question is then, where does this discourse place the subject when they come back home? Because you come back home and you see Israel being criticized by the left, supported by the right. Israel, which has been hammered into you, is a central part of Jewish identity. If we take one aspect of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the campaign against the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. Now, the campaign against it is for very good reason. It's because the JNF is a criminal enterprise, because it is a racist colonizing group. There's more information on stopthejnf.org about it. However, the JNF, the Jewish National Fund for Jews, was seen as part and parcel of their community. It was seen as the blue box on the mantelpiece, like the Trocra box in many ways. And it was seen as giving money for trees. And how can you argue with trees? And so attacking this is seen as attacking them. And so you have this discourse of the new anti-Semitism. The old anti-Semitism came from the right, but the new anti-Semitism comes from the left. So I'm not denying here that there's maybe a programmatic value to Zionists to label their opponents anti-Semitic, but it's not just a tactic. It's something that's genuinely felt. If the only mark of Jewishness is Israel, then attacking that marker is seen as attacking Jews. Now, this also explains the Jewish communal reaction to Jews who oppose Israel and who criticize it, because they're seeing less as attacking Israel and more as attacking the community and its fragile unity through their criticism. And this is why the first thing that's questioned is their Jewishness. Most Jewish critics of Israel, have to run the gauntlet of 3 related assertions made to stigmatize them. They hate themselves, they aren't really Jewish, and they irrationally hate the Jews/Israel. As Emmanuel Ottolenghi, hopefully no relation to the chef, as he put it, their crusade against Israel is less about justice for the Palestinians and more about coming to terms with their tortured Jewish identity. As Melanie Phillips more bluntly put it, these people who criticize Israel are Jews for genocide. Every accusation a confession. The extremity of this is because what's being attacked is the ethnic group's sense of itself, rather than a specific political point of view. Counter-hegemonic challenges within small ethnic groups are notoriously difficult because the sense in such groups of being under attack. But despite these attacks, there's growing Jewish support for Palestinian rights. And this is what I want to talk about now. We've seen it in the actions undertaken by Jewish groups across the world. Even in Ireland, where there is a small but very active Jewish group, where we locked ourselves to the gates of the German embassy in protest of how Germany is leading European support for genocide, a grim echo of the past. And this growth in Jewish solidarity with Palestine has been one of the few glimmers of hope in these grim times. So I'll talk about this and the nature of this solidarity. It's mainly younger Jews, under 40 years old, in which this change has taken place. As Peter Beinart said years ago, for every 10-year drop in age, there's a 5% drop in support for Israel. So, for instance, there's a poll a few years ago where 20% of younger Jews said Israel had no right to exist. And there's another one that shows greater support for Palestine than Israel among Jews under 30. But it's not just younger ones, as this survey shows. This is a comprehensive survey of US Jewish attitudes a couple of years ago, showing this declining attachment to and support for Israel. And this is the reason that Ron Dermer, the former Israeli ambassador to the US, recently advised that Israel should concentrate its Diaspora effects on Christian evangelicals, not on diaspora Jews, because they are, quote, disproportionately among our critics. So what motivates this opposition? Well, firstly, Jews are part of ambient society, and as society around them has become more disenchanted with Israel, so have we. Also, it's the experience of Israel. Israel, it's become more racist, more closed, more religiously fundamentalist, especially over the last decade. The life experiences between diaspora Jews and Israelis have diverged rapidly. For instance, despite the staged nature of birthright trips that I've talked about, many younger Jews on them do see the racism, the oppression, even the way Palestinians are talked about, and they've left these trips. So many have left, in fact, that the organization has started imposing financial penalties on people who exit the trips and engage in what's been called birth left. So the documentary Israelism talks about not just, as I said, the cult-like nature of forms of diaspora Zionism, but also the disgust and the anger many younger Jews feel when they realize they've been lied to by these out-of-touch, Israel-obsessed older leadership that are in charge of communal associations. But beyond the pole of revulsion, there's also a pole of attraction. Many Jewish opponents of Israel would freely admit that while they are interested in Palestine and justice for Palestine, what also motivates them is a desire to model an alternative way of life in the diaspora, a more open, less frightened, more universalist and liberal form of diaspora Jewishness, as one of my interviewees put it about his form of activism and what motivated them. And in this, what you could call a diasporist orientation, they seek to draw on Jewish traditions, both religious and secular, and to rediscover their diaspora as, in Daniel Boyarin's words, the generation and ground of Jewish identity, centering the notion of justice as a fundamental Jewish religious value, as well as recovering a secular history of Jews and left-wing movements supporting universal freedoms. So this movement hasn't just grown. The nature of the movement has changed over the past decade. Connell was very flattering about my book earlier. I'd actually recommend that people don't read it because I think it's already out of date in a very good way. Because when I wrote my book about a decade ago about Jewish criticism of Israel, many of these Jewish organizations were unwilling to voice full solidarity with Palestine, thinking of, for instance, they were equivocal on the boycott or the right of return, thinking that they wanted to be mediators between the Jewish community and Palestine solidarity groups. Now, this has changed. For US Jews, especially, I think it was the Black Lives Matter movement, and this understanding of what allyship meant. I think that was vital. You know, you don't tell a press group how to fight for their rights, and you don't tell this group that their rights should be limited. But even before that, you could see it happening. The experience of working with Palestinians and with solidarity groups led to a growing understanding and a growing solidarity. Now, allied to that is that these groups are far less interested in reaching out to the community than they were when I wrote the book. They're far more inclined to set up their own institutions, their own journals and so on, both religious and secular. Partly this, attempt to create an alternative pole of Jewish identity is a function of their growing strength. There's sufficient numbers in order to set up a non-Zionist shul, a non-Zionist synagogue. But partly it's the result of growing polarization among Jews and the realization, outreach hasn't worked in the past. So, for instance, I know I'm quoting a lot of polls here, but there was a fascinating poll in 2021 that showed a quarter of US Jews agreed that Israel is an apartheid state. But an equal number of 24% said that calling Israel an apartheid state is anti-Semitic. I don't think any better example could be given of the sort of polarization that's happening. It's also seen in that declining numbers of Jews support the two-state solution, whereas increasing numbers support, on the one hand, the full annexation of Palestinian territory, and on the other one, a single democratic state. This decentering of Israel from Jewish life is also reflected in these statistics, which is also from this major Pew report on Jews in America, about the percentage of US Jews who say X is an essential part of what being Jewish means to them. And you can see what I meant by the disembedding of religion from Jewishness, like observing Jewish law, eating Jewish foods, being part of the Jewish community, rank low in terms of what a lot of Jews think is Jewish. And what ranks high is more ethical concerns. The Holocaust is still very high, but also leading an ethical life, working for justice and equality ranks high. And where's Israel? Israel's somewhere between having a good sense of humor and continuing family traditions. It's been disembedded and decentered. Israel is still important, but it's not as important as it was. So this is because Zionism, which was once a central point of unity for diaspora Jews, is not anymore. It's a source of contention, not consensus among Jews. And so this is what I meant at the start of the talk when I said it's complicated. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks, David. That was a fantastic and enlightening talk. And we might turn over for a few questions in a minute. But just beforehand, I wanted to come in on you spoke earlier on about when Zionism emerged and that it wasn't universally accepted, among the diaspora Jewish community. I was listening to something earlier about Bundism, and I think one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto wrote against Zionism, or the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising wrote against Zionism and stuff like that. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that initial hesitation or opposition around Zionism.
Sure. Zionism was initially a revolutionary movement. And initially, when it happened, it faced two things. Firstly, it faced from secular Jews the belief that, the way to improve one's life was to try and improve one's life, to work with forces for progress within the countries you're living in. Now, of course, the famous example of a revolutionary Jewish movement was the Bund, but it wasn't just the Bund. There were also more, you would say, more liberal ways of trying to improve one's life, of working for human rights and justice within the countries. Secondly, there was, from the religious side, which is equally important, the belief that the attachment of Jews to Israel was a religious attachment, not a secular nationalist one. And the idea of forming a state of Israel before the Messiah comes was widespread seen by Jews as religious Jews as being heretical, as being non-Jewish, as trying to like force force the issue. The attachment to Israel was not seen as a nationalist how to say it, a nationalist relocation of people, but much more a spiritual one. And by demanding that people relocate, like Zionists were very much going against this religious tradition. Now, we know why this changed. This changed because of the Holocaust. This changed for the Holocaust because of the Holocaust for two reasons. Firstly, it changed because the argument that Jews cannot live among Christians safely, it was borne out by what happened in the Holocaust. But it was also, in more practical sense, the Holocaust was important because in the aftermath of the Holocaust, you had about 1 million Jewish people in displaced persons camps, and not a single one of the Allied victors wanted them. Not America, not England, none of them wanted them in their country. And so it was seen that like relocating them to Israel was the best option in these terms. So yeah, so this is, as I say, while we can talk about Zionism being a revolutionary movement, being a minority movement, the Holocaust, of course, changed that.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Kieran.
Yeah, having spent a significant chunk of my life living in the northeast of the US and being close friends with people who happen to be Jewish, there was a concept there called PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine. I was wondering to what extent your research bears that out in other diaspora countries such as Canada, Australia, France, United Kingdom, or is it particularly an American idea?
No, it's unfortunately not specifically American. It's, I think that as soon as it was named, it was difficult to maintain. As soon as the PEP concept spread, you couldn't just say, it's everything else has political solutions, but in relation to Israel, it's complicated. We can't talk about it. So I would say it's far harder. As I say, the Zionist middle hasn't dropped out of the Jewish community, but it's been reduced. So, like now, most supporters, an increasing amount of supporters of Israel, aren't progressive, except for Palestine. Those who are progressive, include Palestine within their progressivism, and that is, I think, a worldwide. This particular form of polarization is a worldwide trend.
Okay, and kind of a follow-up question. Reading a lot of American media and even the sort of the jokiness of how to survive Thanksgiving dinner with your older relatives who were rabidly pro-Israel, the sense that a lot of people are reluctant to speak up before their parents die of old age, that they won't change, but someday they will die. Do you think that a point will come where those younger Jews will be dominant to the point where that the diaspora will be seen as predominantly pro-social justice in Palestine rather than forming a bulwark for Israel? And if so, when?
If so, when is a very good question. I don't think there's any inevitability about anything that's going to be happening. Certainly, look, I mean, the way bigotry usually works through a community isn't that people change their minds. It is that the older, bigoted people tend to die and are replaced by younger, hopefully less bigoted people. There are huge pressures working on younger Jews, as I say, who, to make them more pro-Israel. So it's not a given thing that younger Jews are going to necessarily be more tolerant, more pro-Israel. As I say, it's a fight. But I mean, even if you're saying like 10 years ago, there was an identifiable Jewish movement pro-Palestine, but it was tiny. You'd have to argue that it existed. I mean, now with what's been happening, nobody needs to argue that a lot of Jews are pro-Palestine, a lot of Jews are pro-justice. It is a sizable and growing part of Jewish people. Now, where this goes and who wins this battle depends on a lot of things. It depends, honestly, as Norman Finkelstein says, how American society is going to go. And American society, and especially younger Americans, are showing themselves to be much more, much more left-wing and much more critical of Israel, much more understanding of Israel as a colonial state, practicing racism against Palestinians than older Americans. And so, as I say, younger Jews are part of this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just checking in on the chat, we have comments from... there's a bunch of comments offering praise, excellent talk, thank you so much. And just to get, and Martina as well. But Kahan came in there, said JNF tree planting was and is, of course, a political act, part of the idea of redeeming the land under the assumption, redeeming the land under the quotation marks, by the way, under the assumption that it is empty, desert land to be made to bloom, a land empty of anything, let alone indigenous peoples and Palestinians, which I think speaks as well to, I suppose it complements what you were saying about the use of forests and stuff like that. Maybe there is a way to argue with the tree, I guess. And Mohammed came in, said, I think the imperialistic countries of Europe wanted to end the Jewish case in Europe, so they encouraged the Zionist movement and helped it to float to the surface. Getting rid of this problem needed two elements, a land and a motivator. The colonial might of Britain suggested Palestine for the reason of religion, since religions unite people. Western colonial countries use the Zionist movement to achieve their goals of having an entity that implemented their policies. And thank you, David, for this nice talk. I like your way of presenting. Much confidence and informative.
Well, thanks very much. I'd agree, by the way, definitely about the issue about trees. It was done for many reasons. Like, one was to show that, as you say, it was redeeming the land, that the Palestinians didn't deserve the land because they weren't planting these coniferous forests, which, as we see, just go up in flames every summer. There was also a practical reason for it, in that it effaced the existence of the Palestinians who'd been ethnically cleansed. But this wasn't seen in the diaspora. It was seen as, aren't we lovely, we're planting trees. And it was also seen, by the way, as renegotiating the relationship with Israel, this kind of tension between the diaspora and Israel. Because Israel, was seen as, an object of charity, needy little place that needs our money. And this kind of renegotiates the idea of, diaspora Jews as being inauthentic and Israel as being authentic. So it is a kind of complicated relationship. Sorry, I'm using that word a lot.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to come in?
Yeah, just a quick question, Conor. I was there in 2020, and I mean, when you're on the streets of Tel Aviv and other places, and you're talking to people there, it's very much welcome and very nice, and it's a lovely place, and talking up about Israel. And then even when you go and visit the beach, you'd meet lots of American tourists there, and they're Jewish, and they're talking about Israel, etc., and so on and so on. It's almost like I got the sense from them they don't really understand what's over the wall, even though the wall as a metaphor, really, because it's only when you go through those checkpoints that you see everything that's going on. Now, whatever in the last 3 or 4 months, I don't think anybody on the planet can say they don't understand what's going on, because it's been literally all over our screens. But I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think that Jewish people in America and around the world who did support Israel were shielded? And I'm not in any way making excuses for any of them. I'm just saying, to what extent do you think that they were shielded from the reality of, this is the beautiful Israel, but this is like this because we've stolen the land? And to what extent do you think people were shielded from it, is what I'm really kind of asking.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and the answer obviously is as much as possible. That, as I say, I've done research on tourism in Israel, and like where I was doing research was like essentially was a settlement in East Jerusalem, the city of David, where there was like violent expropriation of Palestinians going on under the noses of this particular tourist area. And the way that this was literally through shrubberies and through other means, the way that this was shielded from, which is a very good word, from the view of the tourists coming in, who were presented with this Disneyfied attitude towards Jerusalem. But I have to say, I found it stunning. As soon as I arrived in Jerusalem, you notice the tension. You notice like how deeply unpleasant it is, like how deeply dangerous it is. So I don't know. I in some ways I find it hard. Definitely it's done, but like it's done in, as I say, in tourist encounters, and it's also done by Israel in order to promote its Hasbara. Increasingly, maybe not in the last few months, what Israel was doing was not trying to win any arguments about Israel, not trying to win any arguments about the settlements. What it was trying to do was change the conversation into, look how nice our beaches are. Oh, yeah, if you want to talk about that stuff, but hey, look at this fun thing that's happening. And literally try and flood media and social media with images of everything is normal, everything is perfect, everything is fine. So it's more like ignoring what was happening to Palestinians, rather than trying to counter arguments against it. And it was quite effective propaganda, except it doesn't change the reality. It doesn't change the reality of this grotesque oppression that was, still is unsustainable.
We have another comment from Kieran here. Tree planting and the environmental movement in general has been accused of being white supremacist, with icons like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinochet, that the forests must be preserved and pristine, and Indigenous people damage the forests. The environmentalist movement has to face up to some of its white supremacist origins. On that note, I'd also say, I think when I covered it, I just in an earlier talk, I referred to it as sort of a way of maybe kind of ingratiating themselves with the West. I think there's a forest named after JFK, and I believe we even got one for Eamon de Valera. So I wonder, maybe, is there a role there about the propaganda of the forests being connected into into that sense of supremacy or colonialism, or how it relates to the West, or I suppose the cultural relevance of the forests as they were being planted to non-Jews, maybe non-Jews who are white. I mean,
it's a good point, actually, and it's relating to, let's say, what happened in New Zealand when the settlers went over there. What they bought indigenous British trees, indigenous British plants, and everything like that, and wiped out the native flora and fauna. Because they wanted to make the place look like Europe. And without doubt, the European Jews who went over there had the same desire. They wanted to make the place be more European looking. I mean, this is why, besides the fact that they're fast growing and covers up literally their crimes, this is why they planted these European trees and these European forests there. But it was absolutely, as you point out, with the JFK forest, the Canada forest, it was absolutely a way of trying to foist connection with Europe. I mean, if you take the De Valera forest, which is a small forest in northern Israel, like that was absolutely done in order that Ireland gets closer ties to Israel. And they were trying to get the Irish, obviously maybe not De Valera himself, but some kind of Irish emissary to open the forest and, be there at this forest. The forest itself is on the land of a Palestinian village in northern Israel. And, De Valera was wise enough to the fact, and he said, no, you're okay. We won't. We won't do this. But quite often, people are delighted at the idea that there is a part of Asia named after Europe. So, yeah, there is an absolute colonial element towards the planting of trees, towards the redemption of land or reclaiming of land from the indigenous people.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in with a question?
Without firing in too many questions, David, to what extent do you think that the switch from Israel having predominantly left-wing governments in the early years of the state to having right-wing governments now has led to a switch amongst the diaspora, that Israel would have been seen as a left-wing Jewish project before, say, 1973 or before the first Intifada, and then gradually pivoted to being a right-wing Jewish thing to identify with the left-wing diaspora Jews rejecting it after the beginning of the Intifada?
That's actually a really good question. You're right. It has had a huge effect. Look, growing up in the 1970s, Israel was still seen as this really progressive, forward-looking country. You had women in the military. It was compared to the Ireland of the time. It was probably secular. You had kibbutzim, you had these collective socialist farms. And so it was seen as incorrectly, because it was only seen this way, by the existence of the Palestinians being ignored, but it was absolutely seen as a left-wing collective project. Now, this started to change, not just among Jews, with, as you say, the election of Begin, but especially with the invasion of Lebanon. This was the kind of crucial kind of thing that, all of a sudden, Israel was seen as no longer the David facing Goliath, but seen as the Goliath. And this impression was only strengthened with the first Intifada, which started in 1987, when it was kind of seen, the image wasn't again like Israel facing hordes of Arab armies. It was the stone-throwing Palestinian teenager facing the Israeli tank. And you have had, as I say, I don't think for Palestinians, they would see, if you look at settlement construction, it continues apace, whether there is a Labour government, or whether there was a Labour government, or whether it was a Likud government. But definitely the image of what Israel was changed in the West. And, with the growing, I say, Israel has become increasingly religiously fundamentalist. I suppose I haven't really talked about what this would mean for a lot of Jewish people. Most Jewish people in the US would be Reform Jews, not conservative Jews and not Orthodox Jews. And they barely exist in Israel, and they're made to feel quite unwelcome in Israel. So there is this huge tension between diaspora forms of Judaism and, the Orthodox and conservative form that's more dominant within Israel. So that's definitely one change. But I think, that maybe isn't as important as, how do you say, you know, in Israel over the last decade, we've had fascists in government. Like, I can say fascists because they openly describe themselves as so. But this is the first time, this is the first government where the government hasn't kind of balanced, let's say, fascists on one side with center-right people on the other side, but comprises like of religious fundamentalists, the far-right Likud party, and literal fascists. So you're having an Israel that is like veering hugely to the right, like becoming such an ethno-nationalist state. And I think this is becoming more and more foreign to a lot of Jewish people in the diaspora. And it's definitely, I think, the image of Israel has changed, but Israel also, I think, by becoming more fundamental religious and becoming more ethno-nationalist, I think also its internal composition has also fundamentally changed, which has absolutely affected Jewish attitudes towards it.
Thank you, David. I might come in with one more question. Just you, I recommended your book at the start. You then kind of unrecommended it yourself. I'd like to re-recommend it. In some ways, it does exist as a bit of a time capsule. I accept your point on that, but I think it also captures a very relevant transition in the solidarity movement, which, by and large, in terms of international solidarity in the West, emerged around the Second Intifada in a big way, but particularly also same for Jewish support for Palestinians. But you kind of chronicle the first decade of that Jewish opposition to Israel. It begins as sort of a discourse about, about Jewishness and about the diaspora and how they see themselves. And, you see this emergence of, the role of solidarity campaigns, but particularly Palestinians and their agency and how that plays a role in the politics of activists and diaspora activists around the world as well. I was wondering if you could speak to how that has maybe evolved over the years since. I know this has come a little bit into your talk already, but just has there been a dramatic increase in the decade since you wrote the book, in that kind of recognition of Palestinians, Palestinian voices, Palestinian agency as leaders of their own liberation?
In brief, yes. That like there is this tension within Jewish activism, but I think there's a tension in our long distance activism between, people in social movements want to build up their own identity, need to build up their own identity and like what they're doing. But in solidarity movements, they need to actually, build up, work for, and work with other people. So there is this certain tension between identity construction of the activists and, centering not just one's own identity, but the identity and the desires and the needs of the people you're in solidarity with. Now, so I don't know if this is any more extreme for Jewish solidarity activists than any other solidarity activists, but it definitely is a theme that runs through, Jewish solidarity activism. That how much is it about feeling good about yourself, but then how much is it about saying not in my name, grand, I've said not in my name, now I can go home being a nice person. But I mean, I think this is anything that any solidarity activist can sort of say about themselves as well. And so I've always been a bit two-minded about like the building up of alternative Jewish communities, but I have to say I've been much more supportive of it in recent years, because in the book I was very skeptical of whether that would actually detract from solidarity work. But what it seems to have been doing is, I say, giving a certain ground and giving a certain home towards people engaging in this solidarity work, in times of latency, in times when there isn't a war, you get to hang around with your own people. And, we know this from the solidarity movement in general. Like, one of the reasons I would freely say I'm involved in Palestine solidarity is that you meet the best people here. And I have to say, I found this in relation to Palestine solidarity. In the Jewish group that we set up, this group, Jews for Palestine. And honestly, when we set it up, I was kind of going, well, I'm not going to get particularly involved in it because, like, I'll do important work elsewhere. But for me, especially over the last 4 months, the people in it have absolutely been a support. They've absolutely been, like, I found it just wonderful working with these people. And so there is, something to be said for, building up a Jewish collectivity. Not an exclusive one, not one that says, oh, it's all about the Jews. It's about, liberating Jewish diaspora identity. And, we want to be nice to Palestinians for that, whatever. But like building up this Jewish collectivity is important. What's happened, though, is, which I also see as hugely positive, is that most, like, and again, we're talking about younger US Jews, are kind of sick and tired of the whole, oh, we have to listen to the community, oh, we can't offend people kind of discourse. And they're just saying, and they're voicing full solidarity with Palestine. And one of the reasons is simply, like, if you get involved in Palestine solidarity, you're getting involved with Palestinians. You're actually listening to, and you're talking to, and you're taking direction from actual Palestinians. So you're working within another field of practice, away from, let's say, a specifically Jewish field. And this has meant that, you listen more to Palestinians. So yeah, it's an ongoing process, but it has been a very nourishing and, generally speaking, one-way process in a positive way that it's gone.
Thank you very much.
Is it okay to jump in there?
You can indeed.
Yes. Hi, and thanks, guys, for letting me attend. I'm part of the group that David's being so nice about. And that was great talk, David. Thanks so much. But I just want to agree with him. I think two things have sustained us in this very difficult space we hold. One is the local group, and in Dublin, we're almost like a microcosm of the international movement. You've got young people, you've got people of no faith, you've got people from a socialist tradition, you've got Irish Jews, David being one of them, British Jews, French Jews, South African Jews, an international, and younger people of faith who want to, in a sense, get Zionism off their backs. There's a whole movement now, Judaism beyond Zionism. And there's a massive, well, not massive, but a much bigger example of that in Chicago, where there's an anti-Zionist Jewish congregation. So you've got this combination of old lefties, of which I would say I'm one, and solidarity activists, and these young people who absolutely want to be Jewish, but they definitely don't want to be pro-Israel, and they're pro-Palestinian. There's this, if you like, decolonization narrative going on. And as you say, David, I think the other thing is the primacy of the Palestinian voice, the importance for us to be able to stand alongside Palestinians in the movement and have this dialogue with them. Obviously in Ireland on a much smaller scale. But yeah, it's been a real privilege, I think. And I think the group hopefully has contributed a little bit to that. But just to say, there's lots of other points about colonization, Balfour, and, the absolute dependency of Zionism on Western colonialism from the very beginning. But I think that's a slightly different talk. I think this is really, really useful research, and let's do some more, or you do some more. Thanks.
Can I just ask a question then, kind of in practical terms, I suppose, in Ireland, because this is Teachers for Palestine group, and what we're getting from a lot of school principals when we want to, let's say, have an assembly or bring in a speaker to speak about the situation in Gaza at the moment and what's going on. A lot of the things that we're getting is we probably have one or two or three or four Jewish kids in our school, and therefore we're not going to do that because we can't be seen to be taking sides, etc., 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 and so on. So it's just interesting to get your perspective, David and Sue as well, on that situation. What would you say to principals who say that, or
Good question. Like, I'd be interested in Sue's answer as well. Look, I mean, you can't assume that Jewish kids are Zionist. That's the first basic thing that you have to do. You have to assume that Jewish kids, like other kids, like have a respect for human life, have a respect for justice, and have a respect for peace. And you have to also assume that the kids will want to know the truth. Um, like obviously any speaker that you bring in is going to be respectful, is going to be is going to be telling the truth and not trying to distress people. But at the same time, there must be a thing of, there's not just, there's not just Jewish kids. There's like who want to know the truth because genuinely they do. There's loads of other kids who want to know the truth, who want to know the reality of the situation. And so absolutely it should be presented to them. The point of schools is to educate, would be what I'd say.
No, I would 100% agree. Absolutely. And in fact, it is a stereotype, I suppose, or an assumption that they're making about the students when they say things like that as well, so it's.
I mean, some of them might be Zionist, some of the
Yeah,
some of the parents might be Zionist, but I mean, the point about education is to educate.
Yeah.
And that might be a fantastic note to end the talk on. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, everyone who came along, including some guests from Jews for Palestine who came along as well as I think I see a few mothers against genocide and some other people represented. Yeah, it was a really interesting and enlightening talk and a great discussion afterwards. Thank you all very much. Please follow Teachers for Palestine at Teachers for Palestine on Instagram and at Teachers for Pal on Twitter. And also subscribe to this YouTube channel if you like the content. It would be worth watching some more. And where can we find Jews for Palestine?
You can find Jews for Palestine Ireland on Twitter and I believe on Instagram as well. But God, I don't know much about that stuff because I'm old. But that's where you can find us. And you can also find us at the next Palestine Solidarity demo.
See you there.
See you there.